Today is the week 11 of our semester, and we are going to talk about the water pollution. In this lecture, we will talk about where does our water come from and how do we use it, where and why do water shortages occur, how can we increase the water supplies, what are the different costs or some costs of these methods that we are going to increase our water supplies, what are the different ways we can conserve our water, and we will talk about the water pollution and what are the different sources and effects of water pollution, why are sewage treatment and clean water important in the developing countries, and how can we control the water pollution. Let's start with a case study, which is a water state of emergency. It's an old saying in the American West that whiskey is for drinking, whereas water is for fighting. So it has new resonance lately in California, where many of the states, about 39 million people, and the country's most productive farmland struggle with a persistent and deepening drought. That means the shortage of water. So what the future holds is uncertain, but climatologists they say that it's pretty unlikely that the coming decades will bring as much rain as people would like. In spring 2014, California's Governor Jerry Brown he declared that state's first ever mandatory water use restrictions. So, following those 4 years of worst drought in 120 years of record keeping, and after a year of unsuccessful efforts to encourage voluntary reductions, Governor Brown he declared a mandatory 25% cut in water consumption. So these cuts could be enforced with fines if necessary. At the time of the declaration, the snowpack in the nearby Sierra Nevada mountains, which normally provides about one third of state's water, stood at least 6% of normal. Both cities and farms in California, they have grown and prospered on imported water delivered from Sierra Nevada or even farther afield. In 1913, when the Los Angeles aqueduct opened, Los Angeles was a city of about 350,000. The aqueduct delivered water from Owens Valley, which was about 200 miles away, and it was the beginning of a vast network of pipes, pumps, and canals that allowed the Los Angeles to mushroom to a city of 10 million, with another 8 million in the surrounding region. We all know that the agriculture in the arid southern California also was a modest affair before the aqueducts. Rangers could graze livestock in the hills, but thirsty crops like almonds, oranges, and tomatoes, they couldn't survive most of this dry country. Then irrigation turned the desert into a garden. Agriculture now uses about 80% of California's water and produces a quarter of about food Americans eat. And agriculture drives much of the state's economy in the California. Most of this water, where does that come from? That originates as a snowpack in Sierra Nevada, the snowy range in Spanish. Like here you can see in the figure, the Sierras catch and store the moisture in the form of snow and rain coming in from the Pacific Oceans. And normally that snow has accumulated to depths exceeding like 13 feet at high elevations. This snow then melts into well into the summer, feeding the lakes, rivers that keep the region aqueducts full. So this snow melt also powers the state's hydroelectric dams. When the rivers no longer have enough water to run hydropower stations, electricity may become more expensive. So this snow melt in Sierra has decreased for three related reasons. First is drought. Precipitation always varies over the decades, but drought leading up to the new water saving mandate was the worst ever recorded in the state. So it may be even worse in 1,000 years or more. So second is the short winters. So global patterns of climate warming have produced warmer winters here with shorter snow seasons, more precipitation that falls as rain instead of snow, and earlier melting in the spring. And third one is rising temperatures and increased evapotranspiration. In a warmer climate, water evaporates faster and plants use more moisture than in a cool climate. So, hotter temperatures raise the water demands in valley farm fields, but they also reduce the water supplies that's coming down from the mountains. So, how can the water use be cut? Governor Brown's rule included the restrictions on watering golf courses, cemeteries. He put bans on using potable water for landscape watering and incentives to replace the 50 million square feet of irrigated lawns with dry landscaping. So financial assistance was also provided to help the residents to purchase water-saving washing machines, toilets, shower heads. Agriculture water use restrictions were not specified, but better reporting of water use was required. So a state that failed to comply could be fined $10,000 per day. So, in this chapter, we will explore the world's water resources, how they are distributed, and how they are used. And in the long run, it remains to be seen whether water is really for fighting or if the world's government, cities, and farmers they accommodate a warming climate and its impact on the water of life. Okay. So, like in this figure, you can see the California's water system, which uses hundreds of miles of aqueducts to deliver that water over the mountains and across the deserts from the Sierras and the Colorado Rockies. Agriculture in arid southern California was a modest affair. We all know that we already discussed that before the aqueducts. So, ranchers could graze livestock in the hills, but thirsty crops, like we discussed, the almonds, oranges, and tomatoes, couldn't survive in most of this dry country. Talking about the water resources, the water is essential for life, and water dissolves the nutrients and distributes them to cells, regulates the body temperature, supports the structures, and removes certain waste products. You could survive for weeks without the food, but only a few days without water. So, worsening those water shortages worry the cities and farmers worldwide. In India, India's Ganges river plain, home to half of a billion people, groundwater levels have declined about 30 centimeters in just a decade. China, Syria, Iraq, and other countries they face increasing water shortages. Globally, the military analysts expect that water shortages will increasingly become the focus of wars and refugee crises. So, understanding how these resources are distributed and why they are changing is the first step towards finding better strategies to protect this precious resource. So, conserving the water resources, as California is trying to do, doesn't need to mean disaster. As in California, it may mean fewer European style lawns in the desert. It means the better management of resources that we are using, and it means adjusting our expectations to what the land can support. Here you can see in this graph the water resource withdrawals. That means the withdrawals is reducing the water storage in many of the world's most important aquifers, including those in politically dense regions. So calculated variation in groundwater is derived from NASA's Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment, that is the GRACE, Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment satellites, which measures the changes in mass, that means the water content of the land surface. We all know that solar energy constantly evaporates water, and evaporated water condenses to the liquid or solid snow and ice when it cools. So, general term for falling that liquid or solid water is the precipitation. And most water precipitates somewhere distant from where it's evaporated. So most snowfall on the Sierra Nevada, for example, comes from the evaporation over the Pacific Ocean. These familiar processes, they supply nearly all the water that keeps us and our ecosystem alive. They take up the moisture and release the water vapor from leaf pores, and that process we all know is known as the transpiration. The term evapotranspiration refers to the combined processes of evaporation and also the transpiration. Or, in short, we can say both evaporation and transpiration are much more active in hot climates than in the cool climates. More solar energy causes more evaporation, and plants must transpire faster to avoid that baking in the heat. So in general, we can see water availability is very high near the equator, as in South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, where the solar intensity and evapotranspiration rates are very high. Like here, you can see. Mountainous regions near the coast, such as the Pacific coast of North America, they also capture the moisture, as in the Sierra Nevada. The leeward, that's the downwind side of mountain, that tends to be depleted of moisture. In Hawaii, the windward side of mountain, Valleys has an annual rainfall around 1,200 centimeters. That's about 460 inches. So this leeward side, only a few kilometers away, has an average yearly rainfall of about 46 centimeters. Water availability often varies seasonally. India's monsoonal climate, for example, it has dense most of the year and intense rainfall at the end of summer. So usually heavy monsoons, they can cause the floods and devastation. Unusually light monsoons can spell the disaster for the farmers. Talking about the water resources, the distribution of water is described in terms of interacting compartments in which the water resides, sometimes briefly and other times for eons. The length of the time water typically stays in a compartment is its residence time. So, on average, a water molecule stays in the ocean for about 3,000 years, for example, before it evaporates and starts through the hydrologic cycle again. So, nearly all the world's water is in the oceans, and oceans play a major role in moderating the Earth's temperature, and over 90% of the world's living biomass is contained in the oceans. So, what we mainly need is the fresh water. So, amazingly, only about 2% of the world's water is in a form that is mostly accessible to us. and to other organisms that rely on that fresh water. The winter snowpack on the south western slope of Rocky Mountains, for example, it provides about 75% of flow in Colorado River, which is described in the opening case study uh, as we started the chapter. So drought conditions, they already have reduced the snowfall in the western US, and global warming is projected to cause even further declines. So as we proceed in this chapter, in chapter 15, we will discuss about the climate change, how about the shrinking glaciers and snowfields nearly everywhere in Asia. So the Tibetan glaciers that are the source of six of the world's largest rivers and supply the drinking water for 3 billion people, they are shrinking rapidly. There are warnings that these glaciers could vanish in a few decades, which would bring enormous suffering and economic losses to the continent. We all know that the glaciers and snowfields are those are the sources that provide much of the water on which billions of people rely. So the snowpack in the western Rocky Mountains, for example, it supplies about 75% of annual flow of Colorado River. But like we discussed, that this global climate change is shrinking those glaciers and causing that snow melt to come earlier in the year, disrupting the water, this vital water resource. Originating as precipitation that percolates in the layers of soil and rock, groundwater makes up the largest compartment of liquid fresh water. The groundwater within 1 kilometer of surface is more than 100 times the volume of uh, the lakes, rivers, freshwater lakes, the rivers, and reservoirs if we combine them. Let's now talk about the groundwater zones, what they are. So plants, they get moisture from a relatively shallow layer of soil that contains both air and water, which is known as the zone of aeration. Depending on rainfall amount, soil type, and surface topography, the zone of aeration may be a few centimeters or many centimeters deep. There are some lower soil layers where the soil pores are filled with water, which make up the zone of saturation. The source of water in most wells, the top of this zone is called the water table. Talking about the geological layers that contain water, these are called the aquifer. Below an aquifer, relatively impermeable layers of rocks or clay keep the water from seeping out at the bottom. So instead, the water seeps more or less horizontally through the porous layers. So depending on the geology, it can take from a few hours to several years for water to move a few hundred meters through this aquifer. So what this aquifer actually is, it consists of porous layers of sand or gravel or of cracked or porous rock. Below an aquifer, there are impermeable layers of rock or clay that keep that water from seeping out at the bottom. If impermeable layers they lie above an aquifer, pressure can develop within the water-bearing layer. Pressure in the aquifer can make a well flow freely at the surface. So these free-flowing wells and springs are known as artesian wells, or we call them as springs. Areas where the surface water filters into an aquifer are called as the recharging zones. Most of the aquifers recharge extremely slow, and road and house construction or water use at the surface can slow recharge rates. But contaminants can also enter these aquifers through recharge zones. There are certain urban or agricultural runoff in recharge zones, which is often a serious problem. So people who don't have access to the clean surface water generally depend on groundwater for their drinking and other uses. It has been found that every year 700 cubic kilometers are withdrawn by humans, mostly from shallow and easily polluted aquifers. So we use water for many purposes. Water withdrawal is the total amount of water that's taken from a water body. Worldwide, it has been found that agriculture claims about 70% of total water withdrawal, and that use is increasing. So, we all know that raising a kilogram of grain fed beef takes more than 15,000 liters of water, whereas raising goat requires at least 90% less water. Rice cultivation also, which generally occurs in wet paddies, it takes about 3 times as much as water as raising potatoes or wheat. So evaluating this water consumption can be tricky because much of it is exported in a variety of forms. For example, in California about 15% of all the water use is consumed in producing the alfalfa, which is a crop that is used as a alpha hay feeds, dairying cows, and to a lesser extent beef cattle, whose milk, cheese, and meat are exported all over the US and overseas. Similarly, we have California's almond crop that consumes about 10% of California's water. So, almond growth has exploded in recent years from about 60,000 tons produced in 1960. The industry expanded about 30 times to 1.8 million tons per year in 2013. So that represents that 99% of all US almonds and 80% of world's almond supply. So, to keep these trees alive year round as well as to produce the nuts, it requires nearly 41 of water, more than 1 gallon per each almond nut. So, on a per kg basis, this amounts to about 16,000 per kg or 1,900 gallons per pound of almonds. By some estimates, the water content in exported alfalfa it amounts about 380 million per cubic meter. That means 100 billion gallons per year, enough to supply about 1 million families with that drinking water for a year. Conservation proponents they argue that reducing this water exports could dramatically reduce the water crisis in the American West. So, for some foods, the greatest water use isn't in growing the crop but in preparing it. Our consumption, chocolate, for example, is highly processed before we eat it. It has been found that industrial uses it represents about one fifth of all water withdrawals worldwide. So industrial and domestic uses tend to be far lower than the agriculture uses. Since 2008, another dominant industrial use of water is the hydraulic fracturing, that's the fracking, for natural gas and oil production. So, as the name suggests, that water is pumped under pressure into oil and gas wells to help the fracture geologic formations and release the hydrocarbons that are locked into the rocks. So, this fracking one well uses about 4 to 6 million gallons of water. That's about 15 to 23 million liters. So sometimes the wells are fracked more than once in order to release the additional gas. So most of this water returns to the surface, but it's too contaminated to be reused without a great deal of treatment. So contaminants they include many carcinogenic hydrocarbons as well as the detergents to aid in that are used in the fracking process, and some salts and radioactive particles from deep underground. So, in areas of intensive oil and gas development, as in western North Dakota, northern Texas, and Oklahoma, these water resources can be severely stressed by fracking demands. Stressed California is also using millions of cubic meter of water for the fracking process. It has been found that household water use, that's for drinking, washing, and cooking, it accounts for about 6% of world water use. So amounts of use vary with the well. However, clean drinking water, and basic sanitation are necessary to prevent the communicable diseases and also to maintain a healthy life. United Nations it reports that at least a billion people lack access to safe drinking water and 2.5 billion people don't have adequate sanitation. So as the population grows, there are more people that move into the cities, and agriculture and industry they compete for increasingly scarce water supplies. Or water shortages are expected to become even worse because of the increasing population. So rural people they often have less access to good water than the city dwellers. Water related diseases like diarrhea they are common in areas that have poor sanitation. Every year, it has been estimated that about 1.6 million people, about 90% of them are children, they under 5 years old, they die from these diseases. So more children die from diarrhea than malaria, measles, or HIV or AIDS. So more than two-thirds of world's households have to fetch water from outside home, which is a heavy work done mainly by women and children that takes several hours a day that could otherwise be spent going to school, tending children, or earning an income. Improved public systems they bring many benefits to these poor families, but still they have to fetch the water from outside the home, and it takes about hours to fetch that water. Otherwise, that time could have been consumed in going to school or tending your children or earning some income. The Dust Bowl of 1930s, for example, which only lasted about 6 years, but mega droughts that destroyed the Anasazi cultures in the 12th and 13th century, it lasted about 25 to 50 years. So droughts in the American Southwest are not a new phenomenon. In fact, dry spells in recent years have been relatively short duration compared to the historic events. The groundwater supplies they are being depleted. In many areas of United States, the groundwater is being withdrawn from aquifers faster than natural recharge can replace it. So on a local level, it causes a cone of depression in the water table. So on a broader scale, we can say that heavy pumping can deplete a whole aquifer. The Ogallala Aquifer underlies eight Great Plains states from Texas to North Dakota. This porous bed of sand, gravel, and sandstone once held more water than all the fresh water. So much water that wells have dried up in many places, and farms, ranches, even whole towns are being abandoned. Withdrawal also allows the aquifers to collapse. Subsidence or sinking of groundwater surface follows. The San Joaquin Valley in California has sunk more than 10 meters in the past 50 years because of excessive groundwater pumping. So, where the aquifers become compressed, recharge becomes impossible. So, another consequence of aquifer depletion is saltwater intrusion. Along coastlines and in areas where the saltwater deposits are left from oceans, the ancient oceans, overuse of freshwater reservoirs often allows this saltwater to intrude into the aquifers. which is then used for domestic or agriculture purposes. Here in this picture, it's a photo that's taken in 1977 showing the subsidence caused by groundwater pumping in California's San Joaquin Valley. The 1925 sign indicates the ground level in that year, like here you can see. Dams and canals, they are the foundation of civilization because they store and redistribute the water, which is used for farms and cities. So many great civilizations, they have been organized around large-scale canal system. One of the most disastrous diversions in world history is that of Aral Sea. Las Vegas, Nevada, facing a similar situation with the dying of Lake Mead, which supplies about 40% of its water, has started at $3.5 billion, that's 525 kilometers pipeline to tap those aquifers in the northeastern part of state. One of the most disastrous diversions in world history is the Aral Sea, situated in arid Central Asia on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The Aral Sea is a shallow inland sea that is fed by rivers from distant mountains. So starting in 1950s, the Soviet Union began diverging these rivers to water cotton fields and rice fields. Gradually, the Aral Sea has evaporated, leaving only vast toxic salt flats. So these are the different photographs of changes in that Aral Sea when it gets evaporated and there is nothing left except the salt crust. So would we fight for water? Many environmental scientists they have warned that water shortages could lead to wars between the nations. Fortune magazine it wrote that water will be to the first century that what oil was to the 20th. So, with one third of all human living in areas with water stress now, the situation could become much worse as the population grows and climate change. It dries up some of the areas and brings more severe storms to others. Already, we have seen the skirmishes, if not outright warfare, over insufficient water. In Kenya, for instance, the nomadic tribes they have fought over dwindling water and grazing. So, an underlying cause of genocide now occurring in the Darfur region of Sudan is the water scarcity. So, when rain is plentiful, Arab pastoralists and African farmers they coexisted peacefully. With the inversion of this drought, perhaps caused by global warming, which has upset that truce, the hundreds of thousands who have fled to Chad could be considered climate refugees as well as war victims. So, although they have not usually risen to the level of war, but there have been at least 37 military confrontations in the past 50 years in which the water has been at least one of the motivating factors. So water can be even used as a weapon. Saddam Hussein cut off the water flow to the massive Iraq marshes as a way of punishing his enemies among the marsh Arabs. So drying of the marshes drew about 140,000 people from their homes and also destroyed a unique way of the life. So it also caused severe ecological damage to what is regarded by many as original Garden of Eden. Talking about the biological pollution, which includes the pathogens and waste, most serious water pollutants in terms of human health worldwide, or the pathogenic diseases, organisms, that means the disease causing organisms. Among the most important waterborne diseases are the typhoid, cholera, bacterial, and amoebic dysentery, enteritis, the polios, infectious hepatitis, and schistosomiasis. So, if any coliform bacteria are present in water sample, infectious pathogens are assumed to be present there. So, detecting specific pathogens in water is very difficult and it's time consuming and costly. So, water quality is usually described in terms of concentration of those coliformic bacteria. So, any of the many types that commonly live in the colon or intestines or humans and other animals. The most common of these coli is the Escherichia coli, or we call it E. coli. Other bacteria like Shigella, Salmonella, or Listeria, they can also cause certain serious diseases and even it's fatal or fatal illness. So if any coliformic bacteria are present in a water sample, the infectious pathogens are assumed to be present as well. And Environmental Protection Agency considers the waters unsafe for drinking. Plant nutrients and cultural eutrophication, water clarity, that's the transparency, is affected by sediments, chemicals, and abundance of planktonic organisms. Clarity is a useful measure of water quality and uh, water pollution. Certain rivers and lakes that have clear water and low biological productivity are said to be oligotrophic. Oligo means little and trophic means nutrition. By contrast, eutrophic is the well nourished waters are rich in organisms and organic materials. When human activities greatly accelerate the eutrophication, this is called as cultural eutrophication. So what actually cultural eutrophication is? It's caused mainly by increased nutrient input into the water body, for example, lakes, rivers. So, increased productivity in an aquatic system sometimes can be beneficial. For example, fish and other desirable species, they grow faster, providing a welcome food source. But often, however, eutrophication, it produces some blooms of algae or thick growths of aquatic plants that are stimulated by the elevated phosphorus or nitrogen levels. Bacterial populations then increase, which are fed by larger amounts of organic matter. The water becomes cloudy or turbid and has unpleasant taste and odor. So, cultural eutrophication can accelerate the aging of a water body enormously. Lakes and reservoirs that normally might exist for hundreds or thousands of years can be filled in a matter of decades. So here in this picture, you can see the nutrients from agriculture and domestic sources. They have stimulated the growth of algae and aquatic plants, which reduces the water quality, water clarity, or alters the species consumption or composition and lowers the lake's recreational and aesthetic value. The water becomes very turbid. Eutrophication also occurs in marine ecosystems, especially in nearshore waters and partially enclosed bays or estuaries. Partially enclosed seas, such as the Black, Baltic, and Mediterranean seas, tend to be in especially critical condition. A federal study of condition of US coastal waters found that about 28% of estuaries they are impaired for aquatic life and 80% of all coastal water is in fair to poor condition. So marine animals in hypoxic zones die only because of depleted oxygen, because of the lack of oxygen, but also because of high concentration of harmful organisms, including the toxic algae, pathogenic algae, and parasitic protists. Excessive nutrients support blooms of these deadly aquatic microorganisms in polluted nearshore waters. Red tides and tides of other colors depend on the species that are involved, have become increasingly common where the nutrients and wastes they wash down the rivers. There are certain organic chemicals that include the pesticides and industrial substances. thousands of different natural and synthetic organic materials. They are used in the chemical industry to make the pesticides, plastics, pharmaceuticals, pigments, and other products that we use in everyday life. So many of these chemicals, they are highly toxic, and exposure to very low concentrations, perhaps even parts per quadrillion in the case of dioxins, it can cause certain birth defects, genetic disorders, and cancers. Some can also persist in the environment because they are resistant to degradation and toxic to organisms that ingest them. So, pesticide runoff from fields, forests, roadside, golf courses, and private lawns, these are the principal sources of toxic organic chemicals in water. What are different persistent challenges? Developing countries often have serious water pollution. Japan, Australia, and most of the Western European have improved the surface water quality in recent years. The sewage treatment in wealthier countries of Europe generally equals or surpasses the United States. Sweden, for instance, it serves about 98% of its population with at least secondary sewage treatment, and other 2% have primary treatments. Poorer countries, they have much less to spend on the sanitation. Spain serves about 18% of its population with even primary sewage system. And in Ireland, it has been found that only 11%, and in Greece, less than 1% of people have even primary treatments. So most of the sewage, both domestic and industrial, is dumped directly into the ocean. It's estimated that 70% of China's surface water is unsafe for human consumption, and that the water in half of the country's major rivers is so contaminated that it's unsuited for any use. As we already saw earlier in this chapter, that at least 200 million Chinese live in areas without the fresh water, and sadly, pollution makes much of the limited water unusable. Here you can see that ditches in this Hathan slum serve as an open sewers into which all manner of refuse and wastes they are dumped. The health risks of living under these conditions, they are also very severe. Plastics can be deadly to marine life. A deadly necklace, that's the marine biologists estimate that cast off nets, plastic beverage yolks, and other packing residue kill hundreds of thousands of birds, mammals, and fish each year. Let's now talk about the water treatment and remediation. Studies have shown that as much 90% less raw deersing salt can be used in many areas without significantly affecting the safety of winter roads. So, careful handling of oil and petroleum products can greatly reduce the amount of water pollution that's caused by these materials. Although we still have some problems with persistent chlorinated hydrocarbons that spread widely in the environment, we have already banned the use of DDT and PCBs in 1970s that has resulted in significant reduction in levels in the wildlife. So industry can reduce the pollution by recycling or reclaiming the materials that otherwise might be discarded in the waste system. So these approaches usually have economic as well as the industrial environmental benefits. So companies can extract the valuable metals and chemicals and sell them instead of releasing them as toxic contaminants into the water system. So both markets and reclamation technologies are improving as awareness of these opportunities grow. In addition, there are certain modifying land use that's an important component of reducing the pollution. So, how we actually treat the municipal waste? Under natural conditions, water purification occurs constantly in soils and water. The bacteria they take up and transform the nutrients to break down oils. Sand and soil filter water. Plant roots and fungi they use nutrients in water and simultaneously capture the metals and other product components. So when water is cool and moving, oxygen from the air mixes in eliminating those stagnant conditions where harmful organisms can grow. The high population densities of cities, however, they produce more waste than the natural systems can process. So we have already seen that human and animal waste they usually create the most serious health related water pollution problems. More than 500 types of disease causing bacteria, viruses and parasites they can travel from humans or animal excrement through the water. Most rural households use septic systems which allow solids to settle in a tank where the bacteria can decompose them. And most of the developed countries they require that cities and towns build municipal water treatment system to purify the human and household waste. In conventional sewage treatment, the aerobic bacteria they digest organic materials in high pressure aeration tanks. You can see here. So this one is described as the secondary treatment. Conventional treatment it misses new pollutants. One stream had 38 of compounds that tested. Drinking water standard exists only for about 14 of the 95 substances. So, a similar study found that some substances in the groundwater, which is much harder to clean than surface waters. So, what are the effects of these widely used chemicals on our environment or on our people that consume this water? So, nobody knows answer to this question. This study is a first step towards filling huge gaps in our knowledge about their distribution. Many institutions don't have the space for a constructing wetland. One of these is the Cedar Grove Cheese Factory in southern Wisconsin, which has built a living machine, a sequence of tank, bacteria, algae, and small artificial wetlands. So this system converts the factory effluent to nearly pure water and vegetation. And it has been found that it removes about 99% of biological oxygen demand, BOD, and 98% of suspended solids, 93% of nitrogen, and 57% of phosphorus. When we talk about the remediation, it can involve the contaminant extraction or biological treatments. So often the living organisms they can clean the contaminated water effectively and inexpensively. And we call this process as bioremediation. Restored wetlands, for instance, along the stream banks or lake margins, they can effectively filter out the sediment and remove some pollutants. Some plants that are very efficient at taking up heavy metals and organic contaminants. So, planting those plants that can help in bioremediation. This bioremediation offers the exciting and uh, inexpensive alternatives to conventional cleaner. So there are many sources of water contamination, but there are many ways we can clean it up. So new developments in environmental engineering are providing the promising solutions to many water pollution problems. Surface water pollution is often both highly visible and one of the most common threats to the environmental quality. It has been found that in more developed countries, reducing the water pollution has been a high priority over the past few decades. and billions of dollars have been spent on control programs. Most laws and rules have faced objections because they generally seek to restrict the individual actions that threaten the public interest. For example, the unregulated waste disposal saves money and time for the waste producer, but the public bears the burden of increased health costs and impaired water resources. Opponents of federal regulation have tried repeatedly to weaken or eliminate the Clean Water Act. They object to the cost and to putting environmental interests ahead of economic interests. Despite this, the water protection have been widely supported. Clean Water Act was ambitious, popular, and largely successful. It's also an immense and complex law with more than 500 sections that regulate everything from urban runoff, industrial discharge, and municipal sewage treatment to land use practices and wetland drainage. As a consequence, only about 10% of our water pollution now comes from industrial and municipal point source. One of the biggest improvements has been in sewage treatment. So nearly everyone in urban area is now served by municipal sewage systems, and no major city discharges raw sewage into a river or lake except as overflow during some heavy storms. So, concluding today's chapter, water is a precious resource. As human population grow, water is likely to become even more scarce in the future. We talked about the conflicts over water rights that are becoming more important between countries that share water. We talked about certain federal, state, and local pollution controls that have greatly improved our water quality. And also, we talked about that how rapidly the developing countries such as China and India, the water pollution still remains a serious threat. And also, the constructed wetlands for ecological sewage treatment, they provide low-tech, inexpensive ways to reduce this water pollution. That was all about today's lecture. Thank you.